In the post-World War II era, Americans began to show more of an interest in learning about the cultures of Asia. That culminated in the release of TSR's Oriental Adventures book for Dungeons & Dragons, and we'll talk about it today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support Daddy Rolled a One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about the release of this book, Oriental Adventures. This was TSR's second hardback released for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line in 1985, following Unearthed Arcana a few months before. Now, currently, this is now 2024. We're in August of 2024, and there's been a lot of discussion about this particular book and sort of, the role that it might have played in some maybe negative stereotypes and things like that. And I'm really not going to dig into that part of the game of this book. And instead, I'm really going to focus on kind of two things. First, I want to talk about the context of what was happening in the world, specifically in America, in terms of how they began to view Asia differently, learning about its economics, its politics, and most importantly, for specifics for us, how they were interpreting and being influenced by pop culture coming out of Asia. And then the other thing I do want to talk about within the context, again, is what was happening at TSR at the time and why this book came out when it did, and then the legacy that it had. And then I'm going to get into more of like the mechanics. So mostly what I'm going to focus on in this book is sort of, again, like from the game mechanics standpoint. And here and there, I will add a little bit of commentary on some things. And there's been some video reviews out there. A few of them have gotten some things wrong about this book. They were taking things out of context. And so I want to put that into the proper historical context of the game. Okay, but to start off, I think it is important to kind of understand why this book has developed so much controversy. And it's really important to get to the root of like what Americans know about Asian culture, which before World War II was sadly very, very little. So you do have, Chinese immigrants mostly, other Asians as well, but there was a pretty big influx of Chinese immigrants coming into the country and working on the railroads. So mainly in the West Coasts. So you have that, a lot in San Francisco and also in Los Angeles. And then in 1882, though, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically forbid immigration from Chinese immigrants coming into the U.S. And that lasts for a very, very long time. Really quickly, I'm going to skip a ton of stuff here. This isn't intended to be an educational course. So I'm just trying to hit some major top level beats so that people can kind of understand what was going on. So really, you have like the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands in 1900 by the United States. So people began to learn a little bit more about, these areas in the Pacific Ocean. And a little bit more about what we would call the Far East here in the United States. But again, very, very minimal. It's not something that was being taught in schools. I went to elementary school in the 1970s, and world history consisted almost exclusively of learning about Western European world history. You did learn about things like Egypt, and a little bit as you got into older grades, you might learn about like the Fertile Crescent and like Sumerian and Babylon and things like that. But for the most part, it tended to be focused on Western Europe, and usually you were focusing on a war that was going on, whether it was, the Revolutionary or Civil War if you were studying United States history, or, both of the world wars if you were studying European history. And you were lucky even if you got to World War II by the end of the year. So the amount of information that you were learning and being taught, at least where I went to school up in Central California, at the time, it was very limited to almost being negligible about what you were learning about Asian cultures. So that information was coming from other places. It wasn't coming from an educational standpoint. So then, of course, in World War II, you have the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, huge major news, and that had the unfortunate effect of Americans learning about Japan, but through a negative lens of, American political, machinations at the time and what was happening in the country. And so it began to you would view Japanese culture as like it was sort of a them thing. It was like us versus them. And you're putting these negative stereotypes onto them, which is unfortunately something that has happened throughout world history in terms of whenever you're fighting a war, you always pick out the negative things about the people that you're fighting against. So there was, a lot of say cartoons at the time and comic strips that had extremely negative portrayals of Japanese people. And then, of course, you have the horrible events of the internment of Japanese Americans in camps here in the United States. So it's really like a negative viewpoint that you're having. Now, we were allies with the Chinese during this time, but you weren't really learning a ton about that. Again, and partly that was just by nature also of the media and what was available and what they were focusing on. And the war in the Pacific kind of tended to be a little bit overshadowed by the war in Europe until you had the defeat of Nazi Germany in May of 1945, and then finally the focus began to kind of a little bit more shift to. I mean, they'd been talking about the war in the Pacific, but I again, from what I learned at the time, it was a little bit less to the extent of what was happening in Europe. Okay, so. And there's no judgments here on whether that's right or wrong or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is kind of what happened. All right. So, but then something really, really interesting happens, and it's going to start to impact the way that Americans start to begin taking an interest in Asian cultures. So in the post-World War II era, you have, the American and the Allied forces are occupying Japan, and you're starting to get this exchange of ideas of soldiers coming home that were in the Pacific that saw these things, whether it was in the islands or in Japan itself, and the types of things that they learned about, foods that they ate, and, the language and the people and all that kind of stuff. So that starts to happen. But the big thing was this massive economic recovery that Japan had. And it was miraculous to the point where they called it a miracle. That was what it was referred to as. And it was how quickly Japan's economy recovered after the war. And people hadn't seen anything like this before. And so American business people began to take a real interest in this to try to learn about what was Japan doing that enabled them to recover so quickly, and what can we learn from them that we can bring home and use in our businesses at home. So it kind of starts the interest a little bit from this economic standpoint. Okay, so my point in telling you all of this is, again, I'm trying to help paint a picture of what American culture was learning about Asia during the time period that would have influenced the creation of this book and the concepts that are in this book. Rather than looking at it in a vacuum through the lens of 2024, let's look at it within the context of the time period that it was created. Okay, so you have this economic recovery, and then that ends up spreading throughout East Asia, and to the point where you have, a few decades later, this concept that they referred to as the Asian Tigers, which was 4 Asian nations at the time, Asian countries that had really kind of, their economic policies had really pushed them to the forefront of dominating economy in that part of the world. And, other than Japan, what you had was Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. And those 4 countries, again, were referred to as the Asian Tigers. And so, again, you start to have American business people who are traveling to these countries, to the companies that are there, and exchanging ideas, learning about their culture and how they conduct business. But that does also involve just culture in general, right? As far as just etiquette and social, norms and that type of thing in a business environment. But that does, again, extend beyond just business into culture in general. Okay. And then you have again, economically, things that start to happen, and you have an influx of things like electronics. You have the start of like the Japanese automotive industry making inroads into the United States, and then eventually you're going to get things like, video game consoles that were mostly, coming out of Japan at the time, that were all sort of like gonna hit this point around 1985 when this book is published. Now, that's economically. Politically, you have other things going on. Okay, so you have, of course, the Korean conflict in the 50s, and then you have the Vietnam War, which lasts a very long time from the 60s through into the early 70s. And during that time, media, specifically television, was becoming a bit more prevalent. And so not so much for Korea. Okay, so Korea was still very much approached with this sort of us versus them, and you kind of like create that all North Koreans are the same and they're all bad because they're all communists and we want to defeat them. And so, again, othering of a people because they're not like us, and we want to defeat those people. So that's bad, right? But then in Vietnam, though, things changed because television is much more prevalent now. And so people were watching that war live on television in their living rooms for the first time ever. And they were exposed to imagery that's, horrific because it's wartime, but they're also seeing things that the average American hadn't seen up to this point. The architecture, the culture, the people, the flora, the fauna, the geography, all these things that they're seeing every night on the news, on their TVs. And they begin to, I don't want to say that like it was overwhelmingly positive, because it's not. It's a horrific war. But I think it starts to change people's perceptions of what a war really is, and start to really think about, these are people. This is another group of people. It's not an other, right? So it's a slow start, but it's a beginning to like wanting to learn more, wanting to understand about these cultures and these places that our American soldiers are fighting in. What are these people like, and why are we there? And let's learn about them rather than just, bulldoze them down and take over their country. So baby steps, but that's happening. All right. Then another huge part of this is the pop culture influences that start to come out of Asia and that Americans start to be really interested in. And it starts, even before World War II. And again, this isn't in order, and I'm not saying these are the exclusive things, but something like The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, a novel about, Chinese farmers. And that was a big deal at the time. It was eventually adapted into movies. Now, there was a lot of things wrong with some of these movies in terms of the casting, because it was all white casting, due to, oddly enough, there were actual laws at the time that prevented white and non-white actors from like engaging in certain scenes together. Finally, we got rid of that, thank goodness. But at a time, that was a problem. But people were interested in wanting to learn about this because the book itself is about, Chinese culture. Okay. And then in addition to that, though, you have just tons of other things that start to come out, and it really kind of hits a stride, I would say, in the 1960s. So in popular media, you'd had some Asian characters appearing in, whether it's, comics or movies or TV or what have you, but they were very few and far between. And unfortunately, originally they were usually portrayed as the antagonist, the bad guy. So, and, often with very, unfortunate stereotypical depictions. Okay. But then in the 1960s, you have not, and again, these aren't the first, but there's some of where people start to look at these characters differently. So somebody like Bruce Lee, who plays the character of Kato on Green Hornet. So he's a sidekick, yeah, but he was treated not like a disposable sidekick. Bruce Lee was very charismatic in that role, and his martial arts are just off the charts, right? As far as like how he's able to depict it on screen to make it look really, really cool. And so people, of course, are interested in that. They want to know more about him, and he's able to kind of parlay that role into helping get martial arts style movies, Hong Kong martial arts movies, more into the mainstream. And so, that happens like the early 70s. So things like Way of the Dragon and, of course, Enter the Dragon. Now, obviously, Bruce Lee dies way too young. Very, very unfortunate. But he was such a seminal figure in helping to get this, the popularity of martial arts into the American mainstream. Okay. And that ends up doing things like creating a whole TV show called Kung Fu. right? That featured, Hong Kong style martial arts action. So you also have the character of Sulu on Star Trek. So, and Star Trek was very groundbreaking with this idea that like you're living in a future where people of all different ethnicities and cultures and backgrounds and ancestries, they're all working together for the common good of the United Federation of Planets. And it was never a thing that like Sulu was a Japanese American or, whatever. It didn't matter. He was the helmsman on the ship. And that's a very positive role model for a lot of people who had grown up seeing themselves depicted again as like the bad guys, right? And so here you have the guy piloting the ship looking like you and being one of you. And that's a huge step forward. So, and again, if people who were watching Star Trek, like that wasn't a big deal. For some folks it was, and, too bad for them because Star Trek is here to stay, obviously. So you have that. And then you have things like, we can talk about, the TV show MASH, which although about the Korean War, or I guess I should say, although it takes place, the setting of that is the Korean War. It's really about the Vietnam War, but you have a lot of Asian characters in that TV show. And although it was a comedy, it ends up being more of like a dramedy by the end of the run of that show. And it features a ton of Asian characters in like very positive light. Okay. So you have that. And then you have things like, again, the martial arts action ends up, diving into comic books. And so you have Shang-Chi that debuts in 1973. And, not that long ago had a full motion picture release for the MCU, which I really liked. So I thought that was a really fun movie. I dug it. I didn't know a ton about the character, and I was happy with that. But you also have things like, you have Academy Award winning motion picture like Bridge Over the River Kwai. Now, in that case, of course, the bad guys in that are the Japanese because it takes place during World War II. But again, on a big screen, people are seeing another culture that they're learning about in the course of this movie. And yeah, it's romanticized or fictionalized. I don't know if you'd say it's romanticized because it's a war movie, but so it's not perfect, obviously. None of these sources are perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they're stepping stones to help people want to be interested in learning more and hopefully taking the steps to actually learn beyond just the cliche that you're seeing on the screen or on the page. Okay, so you have stuff like that. And then you have James Clavell's Shogun, which when I was a kid, this was on TV in 1980. And I 100% remember this coming on TV. It was a miniseries event and it was a huge deal. And as I recall, I think the way that they did miniseries back then was that they aired them on consecutive nights. So it wasn't like week after week like you get now with like a show like a Game of Thrones or something like that. That's a limited series, but that airs week after week. What I recall is that it aired like multiple nights just in a row during prime time. And so it was like a huge cultural event, kind of like Roots had done before. And as I recall, I think Shogun followed that example. So now Shogun, obviously, again, extremely fictionalized, extremely romanticized, I guess, but it was, for a lot of people, the first that they were learning about the feudal era of Japan, because that's not something people really had talked about before. And this idea of, different samurai type, families and that kind of thing, and like the political aspects that were happening during that time. And so, again, not perfect, but that was my first exposure to things like samurai and ninja. And as a kid, I ate it up. I thought it was cool. I was like 10 at the time when it came out, or, maybe 9 or whatever. And then, and you'd seen ninja on the big screen before that. Now, I hadn't seen this, but You Only Live Twice, the James Bond movie, has ninja style characters in that he fights in Japan. So, the bad guys, I guess. But again, something that like a lot of people had never seen that before. And ninja kind of starts to take over a huge part of pop culture. And so there was even a very limited run TV series. It only lasted, as I recall, 1 season, called The Master in the mid 80s. And I did a whole blog post about it because I remembered it as a kid and I was so excited to watch it because I just wanted more ninja action. I couldn't get enough, right? So You have all of these types of things happening as far as like pop culture at the time of that are impacting the people, the creators who are going to end up doing these types of books. So even before Oriental Adventures is published, you have at least two other fully developed role-playing game systems that are published. The first one being Land of the Rising Sun, published in 1980 by a game company called Fantasy Games Unlimited. We've talked a little bit about them before. They were massive at the time as far as having like so many different genres of role-playing games, whether it was, like adventure types, like explorers, or whether it was space or psionics and psychic warriors or post-apocalyptic. It just goes on and on and on. And so Lee Gold, who was the publisher, as you recall, of Alarms and Excursions, that was the I think first zine specifically for Dungeons and Dragons. If it's not the first, it's among the first, but I'm pretty sure it's the first. And very cool, still ongoing. I've been chatting with her on email, and I'm hoping to do like a more deep dive into her and her role in the history of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general. But she writes this game for Fantasy Games Unlimited that is based on the mechanics of Chivalry and Sorcery, which was their fantasy game that they put out as sort of like their answer to Dungeons and Dragons. It's a class and level system. The mechanics aren't the same, but they're, I guess you could say broadly compatible with Dungeons and Dragons. But it does have a lot of differences though. So, but this game is a feudal Japanese setting. Characters play samurai type characters. And it has things like, it's got martial arts, it's got an honor thing that you're tracking, and it's got ninja, of course, and so again, people were pulling from the pop culture influences. What are people interested in? Those were the things people were interested in. So I know, like, again, today, a lot of people will quibble at that and saying like, oh, you're just picking on the stereotypes and this is a rich culture. Of course it is. And like, we get that now. And I think nowadays you would approach the subject differently. But at the time, people were looking at what are the things that are being promoted in pop culture, Hong Kong martial arts movies, kung fu movies, and ninja are like two really powerful, symbols of this type of thing that were very popular at the time. So of course you're going to put them in your game. And it's not intending to like, to say that those are the only parts of this culture, or that even that they're the best parts. It's just they're very gameable. There's things that you can throw into a game and kind of like riff off of that. Okay, so that was part of this game. Now you also have another completely different role-playing game called Bushido that is first published by a company called Tyr Games, Tyr, and then it's published by Phoenix Games, and it eventually is going to be purchased by Fantasy Games Unlimited. So at that point, they have two feudal Japanese games, but this one is more of like a fantasy fictionalized version of like a feudal Japan. They called it Nippon, Nippon, and this is by Robert M. I think Charette, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, and Paul R. Hune. And they have based their game sort of like on the Akira Kurosawa movies, like, Seven Samurai and Hidden Fortress, things like that. So that style of filmmaking from Kurosawa really impacted how they created the setting and the mechanics for this particular game. So this game has fresh mechanics. It's not based on an existing system. And a lot of people didn't really like the system as much, but they liked the material, the setting things that they thought that you could port into another game. Other people actually really did like the system. So I guess it just kind of depends on who you are and what you're looking for in a system. But this game has a little bit expanded version of characters that you can play. It has bushi, it has martial, which are fighters, right? Fighting type characters. It has martial arts type characters that you can play. It has yakuza and ninja. It has shugenja, and then it has gakusho. And I know I'm butchering these pronunciations, and I apologize. I tried to look some of these up to see how they were pronounced. I'm not that great at it. So anyway, so those last two are sort of like spell casting type characters in this game, right? So they're based on historical actual things, whether it's religious practices or mysticism and things like that, things that people actually did, but they turned them into game concepts for this. So, and so one was more like kind of like spiritual or like a priest type character, and one was, a wizard, for using a Western term and tacking that onto like another type of culture. Okay, but it also's got, like I said, it's got ninja. They have a birth class tables where you figure out like your social class. That's one of the things that you have to do in this game. And they have concepts like it's very big on like social engagement in this game, which also involve things like honor and loyalty. So I'm bringing those up because we're going to see a lot of these concepts repeated in this book here when we get there. Okay, so that's kind of like what was going on, very, very, high level view of some of the pop culture, the political and the economic things that people were learning about Asia in the time period coming right up to the creation of Oriental Adventures 1985. So, obviously I'm not a historian. I'm not a professor. I'm at best an armchair historian, and that's probably even a little too aggressive as far as that description. But I do think it's important to kind of understand, again, what was going on so that you can see why people viewed things a certain way and why certain concepts are included in something like this. So we've looked at like what was going on elsewhere, including some other companies like Fantasy Games Unlimited and their publication of those two other role-playing games. Well, what was TSR doing during this time, as far as looking at depictions of, including things from, Asian, mythology and culture. And, obviously Asia is the biggest continent with tons of nations and cultures and, hundreds, right? If not thousands. So, well, we have a few things. So not a ton, but we have a few, but we're starting to see things, where they're going to start to want to incorporate more. So if you go like just looking at the 1977 Monster Manual as an example. Okay, so what we have some things in here that are from, myths of other cultures, mythologies. So you have the Kirin. I think that's how you say it. That's what one of my friends told me once. At least as far as that's how you're supposed to pronounce the beer. It's not Kirin. She always makes fun of me when people say, if I say Kirin. So, but you have that, and then you have, I'm just going to pick two, right? There's more in here, but you have the Ogre Mage or the Japanese Ogre. Okay, so just a few examples. Then you have things like even in the Fiend Folio. So first off, you have the what they call the Oriental dragons. And the big thing about these, again, I just mentioned this recently, is that these were neutral. So there were no neutral dragons until you have these. So you have chromatic that were evil. You had metallic, which were good. And then you had the Oriental, which were neutral. And there's a lot of them in here. Okay. So these mostly, I would say, based more on, even just from the names, these are more Chinese than they would be like Japanese. Okay. So they're looking to expand the what they're using as influences and inspiration for including things. So this one, again, I don't know how to pronounce this, Penanggalan. I believe this is, I want to say Filipino, but then I think that's wrong. I think is it Indonesian? I should have looked that up again. I spent most of my life thinking that this was, came out of the Philippines. And I think that there is something very similar in the Philippines, but I think the actual name itself might be Indonesian. Someone can correct me in the comments. Okay, but again, you're starting to see influences of other cultures impact the game and the material that's included. Now, let's go all the way back to Dragon Magazine number 3. I don't have that issue, but I do have Best of Dragon, Volume 1, which includes material from Dragon Magazine number 3, including this class from October 1976, issue number 3, The Samurai. I've talked all about this class before. I have a whole video, I have a whole playlist, actually, that's sort of like a sub-playlist of my D&D history playlist that's focusing on classes and when each class debuted and sort of like tracking them through history. So you want to check out that playlist, but I did a little bit of a deeper dive into the Samurai class. And then also in here from July 1978, issue number 16 of Dragon Magazine, you have The Ninja. Okay. And then you also have, same author, about a year and a half later, issue number 30, October of 1979, The New Improved Ninja. Okay, so these were concepts that, again, people were interested in because they were, part of pop culture at the time. You couldn't get away from it. I mean, ninja in the early 80s were just like everywhere. That's why you have the creation of something like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles eventually, because ninja were just at a point like so ubiquitous, as were mutants with X-Men. So let's combine those two together and get the best of both worlds, right? That's kind of where that concept comes from. Okay, but even as far back as this was Best of Dragon Volume 1, or Volume 2. I think I said Volume 1 earlier, but it's obviously it's Volume 2. But you also have in here, Best of Dragon Volume 1, you have the Japanese mythos. So this was intended to work with gods, demigods, and heroes. Okay, so, this is predating the publication of deities and demigods, and the precursor of that, and I've talked about it here on the channel before, is gods, demigods, and heroes. But so you have this author here, Jerome Arkenberg, who does an article about Japanese mythos. So most likely there was like a book at the library, and this, Jerome's just copying out of it and whatever that library book says. And, back then things weren't fact checked as well. And of course, if it was an American book in an American library, chances are it's written from a very specific perspective. It's through a Western lens and how we understand things, not necessarily going into full detail. So there's lots of things in here that are incorrect or that might be just blatantly, some people might find them offensive. That obviously was not the intent. The intent was, there's this whole mythos that's been ignored in gods, demigods, and heroes. Let's look at it. Let's let people have the option of including this in their games. Okay, so you have that. Now let's go to Dragon Magazine number 67. So we've bumped up a few years here. This is going to come back again in a second. I'm going to refer to it a couple of times. But there is an article in here on page 61. This is by Gary Gygax. Okay, and he's talking about the new classes that we've talked about before. So I do have a whole video on that. But then this is the part I want to focus on. He's talking about what's not going to be in a new book of classes for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He says samurai are an entirely different story. Okay, so granted the monk is not part of a medieval tradition or the usual European-based fantasy, it belongs in an Oriental-based game. So he says, so then why not include the samurai? And he says, well, I don't want to compound the error. So he says he intends to move the monk to the appendices where the bards now reside, and then at some time soon they can begin on another version of the advanced D&D game, which is based on Sino-Japanese culture. While such work will be aimed principally for sale in the Far East, you may rest assured that an English language version will be available to all interested players so that a complete, meaningful campaign based on Oriental tradition and myth can be run. That means ninja, samurai, ronin, yakuza, monks, and possibly Taoist clerics. And he says, and then there'll be a setting that's relative to their powers and interrelationships, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So he writes this all the way back in November of 1982. Of course, that's when it's published. So it was written months before that. It was probably written closer to August or maybe September when he's talking about the idea of having that. Okay. Now, Dragon Magazine number 90. This is the first issue that I got as part of my subscription. I'd read Dragon before, but I was buying it off the shelf or getting as gifts like one-offs. But my grandma subscribed to this magazine for me. And the first issue I got as part of my subscription was this one, number 90. And then she kept up my subscription until she passed away in the early 90s. And then at that point, I took it up. I was already out of school and I was working. And so I took it up. And then I kept up my subscription all the way until it ended with the last print issue, number 359. Okay, but here we have another article by Gary Gygax. And he's talking about Hold That Person, the definitive list of charmable humanoids. Okay, so he's writing a little bit about that. Oh, Okay, so here's where he's talking about what's going on with the game and who's working on what and things like that. And so this is October of 1984. And so he's like saying, regard to games, Frank Metzner is now nearing completion of part 4 of the D&D game system. So this would be the BECME system that we call it. And you can see there, he says the master set. And so he's talking about the manuscript for module T2, the Temple of Elemental Evil. That's never going to come out. It's going to be released later on as T1 through 4. And then he says the upshot is that we're looking at the expansion, reorganization, and revision of the AD&D game system, but it's not going to begin for about another year, and it might take over 2 years to complete. And then he says he wants to first start with the monster book. Now, I have gone over this article a little bit before, but the part I want to focus on is right here. A second volume of the Player's Handbook, will be underway. And he says Francois, and he's talking about Francois, Marcella Freudeval. Again, my French is horrible. My apologies. But that was a colleague of Gary Gygax. That Gary really likes this person, is like as far as his design work. And he says, Francois is currently organizing the material for the Player's Handbook to contain. He says, he and I have collaborated on such material, and he's now compiling what we devised for including Oriental characters in the game. It's going to be written in French, then translated into English, and then, have a final polish. But he's talking about Francois writing, a system for, what he calls Oriental characters in the game of Dungeons and Dragons. And this is in 1984. Okay, well, what's going to end up happening is, so Gary at this point is now on the West Coast, and he's kind of responsible for trying to get a D&D movie made. And this is, again, the short version. There's, way more detailed books you can read about this. But what comes out of that is the D&D cartoon, the old one from CBS from back in the early 80s, right? So that's what comes out of his time on the West Coast. But while he's out there, TSR ends up kind of floundering. And Gary ends up coming back in I believe it was early 1985. It might have been late 1984, like shortly after that article was written in here. But he comes back and is talking about the need for TSR to publish a number of books with his name on them in 1985, like get him out the door and, my name credibility. And he was right. Would, excite people. They'll see that Gary's back writing stuff for D&D because he'd been not doing it for a while. He'd been, aside from the occasional article in Dragon Magazine, he was really doing his own thing out here on the West Coast. Okay. And so he's saying, like, let's publish these books. And so for the first time ever, TSR in 1985 is going to publish 2 hardback books, both said Gary Gygax. Okay. And then there's an interesting thing here because you see this one says by Gary Gygax and this one just says Gary Gygax. We're going to cover that in a second. But and then there's other things that are going to come out. There's some modules. I think that's when finally that T1 through 4, like the super module that was started with the Village of Hamlet and then includes the Temple of Elemental Evil. I think that comes out in 85, or at least it was intended to. And so there's that. And there's just like a few other things, right, that come out. But the big 2 things were Unearthed Arcana, which comes out earlier in 1985. And we have a whole video on this where I talk about like what this book is, why it was made, what's in it, that kind of thing. Okay. By Gary Gygax. And that's true because most of the content of this book, the vast, vast, vast majority, like 90%, I would say, is actually stuff that he'd written in Dragon Magazine before, like in his columns. And then that got put into this book because that was a quick way to get a book out. So I don't think this is the book that Gary necessarily intended when he was talking about, new classes and like, dividing things up. I think he would have preferred to take more time, but they needed to get something out right away. And so taking these pre-written articles that were already done and then just doing new layout and art and then putting in that book was a great way to get that done. All right. So this book is a huge seller. However, its sales are eclipsed by this one. So this comes out in October of 1985. So right at the tail end of the year. Now, interestingly, it's going to come out the same month that Gary Gygax kind of loses control of his company, is voted off the board, is stripped of his creative duties at TSR. So at that point, he's just a board member with no power and no contribution to the company as a whole. He's going to end up leaving a year later in 1986. But by this point, when this book was being developed and, laid out and all that kind of thing, because again, remember, this takes forever. Back in the day, you don't have the ability to put a book out as quickly as we do now. So at that time, he was still at the company and, had a sense of control. But So this comes out, and it is, it does help the company. It doesn't necessarily help Gary, of course, but it helps TSR as a company because of the amount of sales that it generates. Okay, so with that, admittedly long background out of the way, let's take a dive into this particular book. Okay, so we start out, we've got this really fun cover painting by Jeff Easley. So again, this is part of the Orange Spine series of books, and Jeff Easley's going to do the cover art for all of those, and that's going to extend even when you get into like second edition. Those don't have orange spines, but he does the initial round of cover art for second edition Advanced D&D. Okay, so official Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Oriental Adventures by Gary Gygax. It doesn't say by, it just says Gary Gygax. And then you have what we would assume is a samurai type character fighting a ninja. It says all the necessary information to add Oriental Adventures to your AD&D campaign for beginning to advanced players. This fascinating sourcebook contains all new information for players and dungeon masters ages 10 and up. Now, some of the unfortunate language is going to come on here. And again, I don't think this is not intentional. This is just a product of the time, unfortunately, and how people kind of talked about things. And our language is shifting to where, this is not something that you would do today. That doesn't mean that this book was done with ill intent, however. So the mysterious and exotic Orient, right there, that's called othering. Okay. So that's, the implication that everybody from, the Far East or the Orient is mysterious and exotic is ridiculous. Land of spices and warlords has at last opened her gates to the west. So again, I think there's just a lot to unpack there. I'm not going to get into that any more than what I've just already said. And then it just talks about, like what's in here. Okay. As far as like mechanically. Okay. So when this came out, I guess the price isn't on here. Oh, there you go. So that's $15. So for a while, the rule books, the initial ones, like the, I just moved it, like the Fiend Folio, the Monster Manual, like all those ones were 12, and the Dungeon Master's Guide was 15, and it was because it was so much bigger. But by the time you get to 1985, now we've moved to like a $15 price point for all the books. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this up. Now, I have to be very gentle with this book, and this is another thing that people complain about with this book a lot, and it was very common with the late era Orange Spine, kind of like the, mid to late 80s books that TSR published, was that the binding was terrible. A lot of people will complain about it in this book, Unearthed Arcana. Mine is fine. Okay. Knock on wood, just so to say. But this book, Oriental Adventures, is unfortunately my only book of all of my Advanced D&D hardbacks where the pages are starting to come loose, and it sucks. Because I don't know how to fix it, and I don't want to ruin my book trying. Okay, so it says Oriental Adventures. Now you have a drawing here. This is, I assume, Jim Holloway, just by the style. It says Gary Gygax. It says with David Cook and Francois Marcella Freudeval. So let's just talk about that very briefly. What's happening with this? Well, as you saw way back in 1982, and it probably had happened before that, but first Gary starts publishing things about it officially where you can read about it. In 1982, in that article in Drag Magazine number 67, he's talking about wanting to do an Oriental, he called it Sino-Japanese version of the game. And, to include like characters and concepts from that. And it looks like from the way that he writes it, that the intent is to create a version of the game that would appeal to people that live in the Far East. So if that's your goal, you probably should have people that live there, or at least are of that culture and know about it, consulting on that. He did not, but he was working on it, and then he passes that on to, it's his kernel of an idea, and then he sort of assigns that to Francois Marcella Freudeval, okay, that you just saw that name there. And again, my apologies for my poor French pronunciation. So he works on this. So then the legend, or legend's not the right word, but like the what people have said is that essentially Francois is working on this. But then Gary Gygax returns from the West Coast to TSR in Lake Geneva, says like, we need to publish these books now. So this book needs to be out by the end of 1985. There's no time to wait. And it's already 1985 when he's saying this. So they've got to get this thing done quick. So what happens is Gary Gygax works with Dave Cook, who had been hired a few years prior, and he was a designer. He's the guy who designed the expert set for the original basic not the original basic set. That was Holmes. The second basic set for D&D, edited by Thomas Moldvay, the one that I play and I talk about all the time, Moldvay Basic D&D, or BX. Well, the expert set for that game that takes characters from levels 4 to 14 was written by Dave Cook with Steve Marsh. So that was sort of his big claim to fame. I would say at this point in time, he'd also written a bunch of modules. Okay. But he's a designer. And so Gary works with Dave and sort of like assigns the contract to Dave and says, I need you to finish this up, take what Francois has done and then build on it. And what Francois has, depending on the story you've heard, it's either 30 or 60 typewritten pages that are double spaced. So nowhere near enough to fill a book of this size. Okay. So what's known and what everybody can agree on is that the original idea for doing something like this was Gary's. Francois wrote a part of a manuscript that was never published in whole, and that Dave Cook ended up writing this book. So it's not by Gary Gygax, which is why it doesn't say by Gary Gygax. It just says Gary Gygax, and that was just to put his name on this book because they knew it would sell more than having Dave Cook's name on the book. That's just marketing. Okay. So Dave Cook wrote this book, perhaps using concepts that Francois had developed, but perhaps not. And that's sort of like the gray area there, because to my knowledge, nobody has seen the original manuscript that Francois was working on. So who knows? Okay. But you have this special thanks here. Okay. So this is to all the people who kind of like, worked on this book. And so they're thinking like very specific people. And we've talked about, I think at this point, pretty much everybody on here before. Okay, and then here's the credits, and so it says the original AD&D game is credited Gary Gygax. Of course, I mean, we're not going to mention Dave Arneson at this point. That would be disastrous for TSR and Gary. The original Oriental Adventures concept, and again, we see here Gary Gygax with Francois Marcel Freudeval. Oriental Adventures designed David Zeb Cook, so he writes the book. Editors Steve Winter, Mike Brolt, Ann Gray, and Tad Russell. Cover art Jeff Easley. Illustrations Roger Ropp. James Holloway, Jeff Easley, David Sutherland. Again, I think we've talked about most of these folks before. Cartography, Dave LaForce, who used to be an artist for TSR, but he ends up, that's Diesel. If you've ever heard those or seen those initials, DSL, that's Dave S. LaForce. He sort of makes the transition from being like an illustrative artist to being a cartographer for TSR. Okay. So we see some other people there, and then you have illustrations taken from Symbols, Signs, and Signets by Dover Pictorial Art. Okay. Now, one of the things that was really interesting in here that I understand that this happened was that after Dave Cook wrote this book and Gary submits it for publication, the indicia down here gets changed, and it indicates that, see, this says any reproduction or unauthorized uses of material are represented here and is prohibited without the express written permission of TSR. So it's telling you that the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, stuff, the rules are copyrighted to TSR, but apparently there was a version of this where in the credits it says that Gary Gygax was the copyright holder of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and Mike Brolt, who was the one of the editors, he caught that when it came back, and he was like, "What's up with this?" And so he went to the TSR's lawyers, who then ended up confronting Gary and getting it changed to go back to indicate that the copyright of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons belonged to TSR. All right, so then you have this preface here by Gary Gygax. So he writes a nice little intro, September of 1985. So that would have been right before this thing went to print. Okay, because this does come out in October of 85. I very specifically remember getting it after school, my mom driving me over, and I'd saved some birthday money, and I just couldn't wait for this. Like, the ads in Dragon Magazine were just so compelling to me at the time. Okay, so I'm not going to read this, but here's his preface where he talks about, and see, you can see my pages coming out. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more careful with this because I just don't want it to completely come out. Then you have the introduction, by Dave Zeb Cook, also September. And he's, very different writing style. And that's one of the things you can tell that this wasn't written by Gary. You could just tell from the writing style. Gary has a very specific way of writing. But he says, it's with great pleasure that I write this, so I get to introduce new readers to a longtime fascination of mine, the Orient. So that's one of the reasons that Dave Cook was picked to write this book. To take what Francois had done and then develop it into a full hardback book for AD&D. Was because he was known around the office as being the guy who was really interested in learning about Asian culture, whether it was like from movies or books or comics or whatever it was, history, mythology. He was the guy. And we can talk, and he's talking about all the different influences that he looked at, okay, and historical periods. And then he says, the second part comes from all the reading that I had to do, because he had to read materials that he otherwise never would have seen. Okay, so he's learning about the folklore and the legends and the, philosophy, religion, poetry, architecture. He talks about all of that. Okay, so that's a lot for one guy to do. And again, nowadays that would sort of probably be divided up by a lot of people, and you would have like a cultural expert, hopefully. But just to give you a sense of what he was doing, this is, I think, the only advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardback book that has a bibliography talking about the, mostly non-fictional resources that were consulted to help create this book. Okay, so that's a huge deal. Like, just to show that, like, this wasn't something that, like, he just watched a couple of movies and was like, oh, I want to put ninjas into my game. Like, he really tried to do his research. Now, the research that existed at the time might not be as, like I said, exhaustive or as, balanced as something that we would get today. But there was an attempt to learn as much as possible within the context of the time that he had to write this and put it together, but also trying to pick out the concepts that would make sense for a role-playing game product. Okay, so then we have the table of contents. Now, very similar to what we saw in Unearthed Arcana. So if you've seen my video on that, you know that in Unearthed Arcana, the book is divided up into a player section, and then back in the back here, you have a game master section. There it is. Okay. So Oriental Adventures is divided up very similarly. They just don't label the sections. But your player section is creating player character, ability scores, classes, races, families, clans, caste, honor, money, equipment, weapons, okay, proficiencies, spells. And then once you get here to combat, that starts the game master section for the most part. Okay, because as you recall from other videos I've done, combat in advanced D&D, like the combat tables and how it works and what you need to roll to hit, all that stuff was in the Dungeon Master's Guide, not in the player's handbook. Players didn't know that stuff. They just rolled what the DM told them to roll. Okay, but that section also includes martial arts, events and encounters, encounter tables by terrain type, monsters, a little bit more in here. For the table of contents, you have treasure and magical items, and then you have an overview of Kara-Tur, which is the fictional continent that they create for the specific game. Now, originally, my understanding is that that was supposed to be tacked on to the world of Greyhawk, and that they were working on how to develop that. But then it's in here as like a standalone. There are no ties to the world of Greyhawk as this is presented. And then eventually, fans of the Forgotten Realms will know Kara-Tur is instead tacked on to Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms, but it's not his creation. That was from Dave Cook. And my understanding, again, is that Ed has said that that's something that he probably wouldn't have done had he continued to kind of have sole control of the Forgotten Realms. So let's continue with our look at this book. And again, I'm trying to be careful with how I open the pages, so that's why I'm holding up like this. But it starts out with creating the player character. So the intent of this book was that you could take this and not have to have the player's handbook, like the advanced D&D player's handbook. So it's going to repeat a lot of information that it's found in the player's handbook. It's presented differently, but the end result is the same. It's going to tell you about your ability scores and what those ability scores are. So now, very interesting in this one, you've got, your original, you've got strength, dexterity, constitution. So this is where things are starting to change as far as the order, because initially, if you recall, the ability scores were presented in the order of strength, intelligence, wisdom. And the reason for that was because those were the 3 prime requisites for the fighting man, magic user, and then cleric. Cleric being the 3rd class that was added after fighting men and magic users. And then dexterity becoming the prime requisite for thieves once that class is introduced. And then constitution and charisma, which at the time no class had as their prime requisites. However, here it's changed into what most people would think of as like the more familiar, like, your physical scores up front, strength, dexterity, constitution, followed by your mental scores of intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Now, this book, Oriental Adventures, has another score, comeliness, which reflects physical attractiveness, social grace, and personal beauty. So there's a very famous, I guess you'd call it famous, within the YouTube sphere, review of this book by 2 people. They're much younger than I am, so they were not around when this book first came out. They're looking at it through a more, I guess you'd call it like a modern lens. They also are people of Asian ancestry, so they have a much closer connection to how things like this might be interpreted by their culture. Okay. But I remember very specifically watching that video review, and they thought it was ridiculous that comeliness was in here because they said it's just adding to the fetishization. I can never say that word. Fetishization of the Asian culture by, Americans. And this is the only thing I'm really going to point out where I have a problem with that, because this comeliness score was not invented for this book as they made it seem like in that review. The way that it's proposed in that review is that this score was created so that you could rate how attractive, and very specifically what they say is how attractive a female Asian character was. Well, comeliness, of course, debuts in 1982. We've already looked at this. But this is in Dragon Magazine issue number 67. And you have that article by Gary Gygax on page 61. And he talks about a beautiful idea. Frank Messer and Francois Marcella Freudeval, our friend, are already hard at work, and I'm being forward with suggestions, blah, blah, blah. Francois uses a beauty attribute for his characters, and I have come to the conclusion that you might also like to use such a rating. Here are my thoughts. Comeliness is the word for this attribute. So beauty is too specific. And then he goes on to detail how you would roll comeliness for your character. So this is from Dragon Magazine, number 67, 1982. And comeliness is then included in Unearthed Arcana, which, remember, is published before this book. Okay, so comeliness is added as a 7th ability score that your character might want to have right here. Okay, so I didn't like comeliness. I put it on my sheet because you were supposed to, but we never really used it. But it has absolutely zero to do with the fact that this is Oriental Adventures. Comeliness wasn't invented for this book. Okay, that was something super easy to look up. There was no reason to have made that mistake. I make a ton of mistakes in my videos. Obviously, I get facts wrong and dates and things like that. I try to correct them when I can, but it's usually things like I get a date off, or one time I called Dwayne Jenkins, I called him Dave accidentally, and somebody pointed it out, and I was like, yeah, my goodness, that was just an error because I don't script my videos. But implying that comeliness was invented for this book was not something that could have easily been looked up and avoided. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so you've got your ability scores, and then you get into your character classes and races. Okay, so first off, he goes into the character classes. So you have barbarians, which were, again, in this book, debuted in Dragon Magazine number 63, but then are included in Unearthed Arcana to become a core character class, which it still is today. So they repeat that for Oriental Adventures. You can play barbarians. However, in here, it's called the Oriental Barbarian because they're different. They have different abilities and cultures and things like that they're based on. Then you have Bushi, which he says are professional soldiers from nearly all ranks of society. Kensai, martial artists. Monks, which are from the player's handbook, but are going to be repeated here, and they're going to be a little bit different. Ninja, samurai, shukenja, sohei, wujen, and yakuza. Okay? And then they're going to map them to the traditional AD&D classes. So it's not always a good fit. Sometimes it's like trying to, what is it, like stick a round peg in a square hole, whatever, or square peg in a round hole, whatever that phrase is, right? So a lot of times it's a little clumsy. It's a little clunky, like how to try to map them, but that's being done for game mechanics purposes. You have sort of certain roles. You've got your fighting people. You've got like your spiritual priestly buff type people. In your cleric, and then you've got like your controller type characters, your intelligent spellcasters with your magic users, and then you've got like your sneaky exploring, finding traps, like those types of characters. Those are your roles. So it's trying to obviously stick all of these concepts that are coming out of Asian mythology, folklore, legend, and history, and put them into one of those things where sometimes they might not always fit. Sometimes there could have been like, does it go here or here? And you're making a choice for a game mechanics purposes. Okay. And then it's going to talk about briefly the different races that you can play. So again, my pronunciation's not great, but you have the Hengyokai, intelligent animals that can assume animal form, shapeshifters. That's a very prevalent legend or a folklore of, like, shape-shifting animals, not just in the East, in the West also. There's a common thing, shape-shifting animals, but for whatever reason there was a decision made to adapt that as a player character race. You have Korobukuru, which are essentially what they describe in here as sort of like a Japanese dwarf or an Asian dwarf. Which is, that's a very simplistic and reductive analysis, but mechanically that's sort of the role that they play. And then you have spirit folk, which ancestry includes various spirits of nature. They're closely attuned to nature and natural forces, but they look human. So that's it. Those are sort of like your four, what they call races or species that are going to be in here. And then here's your table telling you which one can be which class. Of course, humans always can be any class, and they're unlimited in their levels, except for monks, because monks tap out at 17. They can't go higher. So, but then you see over here, like, what the other different races can be. Okay. So I'm not going to go into super detail on all of these. So this then describes all the different races. So yeah, you see here, they call them Oriental dwarves, the Korobukuru. And that they can be barbarians, bushi, samurai, and wujen. So mostly fighter types, but also wujen magic users. Hengyokai, intelligent shape-changing animals. And then there's several subspecies, each with a different style of animal, which I thought was kind of cool at the time. I thought it was neat that, like, you could pick what kind of animal type your Hengyokai could change into. Was pretty neat. And they all have different abilities and things like that. So playing a shapeshifter just as a concept is a pretty cool thing for a role-playing game, no matter what the setting is. So they can be Shukenja, Kensai, Bushi, or Wujen. Okay, and then they can never be samurai or ninja since they're not human. Okay, I don't know what that is, because Korobukuru, are not human, but I believe it says that they can be samurai, right? So, like, AD&D is full of little weird contradictions like that you would have thought somebody would have caught, but they didn't. Okay, and then you talk about your animal form, like the mechanics of how to play it, and then you've got your spirit folk, the descendants of humans, and various spirits of nature. So if you look at that as being like a human with some kind of like supernatural ancestry, I mean, it's really not that different from like a tiefling or just forgot the name of the good aligned version, because nobody does them anymore. But when, like, you've got tieflings from demonic ancestry, and then you have I'll put it up here on the screen, but whatever that version is, it's the same thing, but for good aligned, planar creatures. So the spirit folks are kind of similar, except that their supernatural ancestry is coming from like spirits of nature as opposed to like forces of good or evil. Okay. And they have, I believe, the most options other than humans as far as like the kind of characters that they can play. And then they can, you have like your three versions of spirit folk. You can be bamboo, river, or sea. Okay. And then it goes into like the details for each one of those. So, if you boil this down and kind of strip out the historical and mythological concept, you've got shapeshifters, you got dwarves, and then you have like, humans with supernatural ancestry. So all of which are, relatively common in, a standard D&D game. It's just, this has the trappings of like a different culture on top of that. Okay. Then it gets into like your barbarians and everything. So again, I'm not going to go too much into this. One of the things people say about this, and I think it generally is true, is that these classes are, for the most part, I'd say more powerful than their counterparts in the Western thing. And, something like a Bushi, okay, which is essentially the fighter class for so they use 10-sided hit die just like a fighter. They get the same attack bonuses like a fighter. They can use any weapon. They can wear any armor. All the things that a fighter gets, plus they get other stuff. So, they have, it's not really well detailed, or it's not well laid out, I should say. But, they're often quite poor and find it difficult to buy and maintain their armor and equipment. So they all begin with basic proficiencies of weaponsmith, armor, and bowyer. And in addition, their lack of armor gradually teaches them to be nimble on their feet. So in addition to any defensive adjustment a Bushi may have from high dex, their armor class improves by 1 step for every 5 experience points. So +1 every 5. And then they're seldom out of work. There's always a need for a stout warrior. So it goes on to talk about that, how they can get, in a friendly or neutral village, they can get employment, food, and shelter. So these are all like role-playing perks, but they're perks nonetheless, right? So these are things that can be helpful during an adventure. They're also giving you a sense of like what this world's like and how to play this type of character. So these aren't necessarily mechanical bonuses all of the time, but they talk about finding loose equipment and a 20% chance to find any common piece of equipment in any village, and then that chance increases as you go on. They're also known to cut or lift strings of cash, so basically they're going to pick pockets essentially. So that goes on, but then the experience point table for the Bushi, a fighter in AD&D, I believe the experience point to get to second level is 2,000, but here it's only 1,500. So it's this like weird thing of like, well, why wouldn't you just put them on the same experience points level as a fighter, especially when they're getting all these additional goodies? Okay, so whatever. So then you have your Kensai, which are like sword masters. They're martial artists, but they're intended to be sword masters, but eventually it's like weapon master is what it really comes, because you can specialize in any weapon. And they're super good at using that one weapon, but they kind of are not so great at using anything else other than that weapon. Okay, so those are your fighter types. Then you have your monk. Okay, so it's very, very similar to the one in the player's handbook, but it's a little bit slightly different. Okay, then you have your ninja. Now, the ninja class in this one is interesting because it's not really a separate class. They have to operate as another class. So you see here, it says it's not an independent character class. So because they don't, the idea is that they don't really exist. And so they're only open to humans, and they can only be taken as a special split class. To become a ninja, you have to first qualify for a Bushi, Sohei, Wujen, or Yakuza. And that's kind of what people think you are. And then on top of that, you're also a ninja, but your disguise might be that you're like, just a lonely, traveling warrior looking for employment as a Bushi. Okay, so that's kind of like how they deal with the ninja in here. They get some pretty cool, tightrope walks, but anything that you would have seen in like a ninja style movie, they're going to get. So then you're going to have your samurai over here. Now, one thing that they don't do in here is none of these have level titles. This is the first time you're presenting classes without having level titles, other than the barbarian in here, which is presented with level titles that are just barbarian at every single level. So samurai in here, I mean, they're presented as being like warriors or fighter types, but they are going to end up making them a subclass of the cavalier, which is another class that was introduced in here that originally, when it was in Dragon Magazine, had been a subclass of fighter. But in this book, Gary strips it out and says, like, no, cavalier is its own class. And then he puts paladin as being a subclass of cavalier. And then the samurai from this book is going to end up becoming a subclass of cavalier. For whatever reason. Okay. Then you have your shukenja, which are in this book, they're presented as basically this is your replacement for your cleric class. Mechanically, like, I'm not saying culturally, but like that's kind of the role that it's playing. Okay. And then you have the Sohei, which are kind of like, almost like a paladin, not quite. It's put as a subclass of cleric. So I guess it falls more in the cleric. But these are like, again, it presented in this book that says warrior monks, religious soldiers who protect large monasteries. So they're more militant than holy. So they get like D10 hit dice instead of D8. Okay. So they're associated with religion, but the duties are closer to those of a bushi or a samurai. So it goes through that. And then you have your wujen, which are, your not replacement, but your archetype for your magic user from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And so they can cast up to 9th level spells, just like a standard D&D magic user, advanced D&D magic user. Then you have your Yakuza, and this is going to be a subclass of thief, essentially. But it says there are many different things. The Yakuza is many different things depending on who is asked. He's been called a protector of the common man, but a thug, extortionist, rowdy, thief, mercenary, jack of all trades, and even an unofficial police force. So then it goes on to describe them and all of their abilities and that kind of thing. So if you guys want more detail on some of these, I'm assuming a lot of you have seen this book before, but if you want more details on the specifics of these classes, let me know. And I can always just do a video just on the classes from this, if that's something that you would watch and would be interested in. Okay, so then it talks about, character abilities, making multiple attacks, gets into alignment, multi-class and dual class characters. So all the things you would have seen in, the player's handbook. Okay, now talks about languages. Again, standard. And then this is, again, where it talks about how you're going to divide this up. So barbarians, bushis, and kensai are fighter subclass. Monk is just a monk class. Ninja is a thief subclass. Samurai is cavalier. Shukenja Sohei cleric. Wujen magic user. And then Yakuza thief. Then it gets into families, clan, and caste. So this is a big part of this book, and it's something that's going to end up... See how my pages are coming out there. It's going to end up sort of like a part of like some of the first adventures that are published for this, for Oriental Adventures. Sort of like building your own family and like your family ancestry and who is in your family's history, what your social class is, and that kind of thing. And that's a pretty big part of developing your character. And then you have your ancestor, like they might have been a criminal, or they might have, run a traditional business, or owned a modest farm, or a small town, even, like all these different things. And of course you're rolling for this to kind of see like what you get. So, it's part of this book. However, this is something that you could, if you're really into this kind of thing, you could take this and use it in any D&D game, regardless of the setting. There's really nothing setting specific about this. So I always thought it was kind of cool because I loved making like family trees for my characters back in the day. And so having something like this where there's a little bit more detail and giving me ideas of like who these ancestors might be other than just their name, but like, something about them that might impact how I play my character, like how others might view me or my family. I thought that was pretty neat. So I like I said, I kind of liked it. So, but you have your birthrights and things that you might get depending on who your ancestors were. So, and as we saw in some of those other games that we talked about before, like Land of the Rising Sun and Bushido, like these types of things, like this family and ancestry and stuff, that was sort of like part of those games as well. Like the whole social aspect of the game was a big deal of those for whatever reason. No reason why you couldn't do that in, like I said, in a non-Oriental Adventures game, but it was debuted in this book. So then you have this concept of honor and tracking your honor and what that means. And every character class has different things that are going to give them, points, or they're going to take points away from their honor. So this is another thing people kind of complain about a little bit because, it's the stereotype of like, the honorable, Asian, person, or like, like whatever. And it's like, we're not all like that. And yeah, absolutely. That's very true. I do think like, I don't like things like this because I find it too fiddly. I don't need to track something like my honor. Either my character is honorable and wants to act that way, or they don't. I don't really feel the need to have a system for it. However, this is a system that you could, in theory, take and apply to something like, a Western feudal knight, a chivalric type knight, and kind of, come up with some new categories here to track honor if that's something that you kind of like want to do, and maybe you want to give your knight like abilities that will go away if their honor score falls below a certain level. Again, that's not something I would do because I don't find the need to track yet another thing is something that was really interesting for me. But if mechanically you're looking for something, this isn't half bad. At least it's a good start. But again, I wouldn't just limit it to an Oriental Adventures style game. I think if you're going to use it, then use it for everybody. Okay, then you have money and equipment. So there's really some cool stuff in here, like equipment wise. And what I really liked was it had like these drawings of like what these weapons were, because a lot of these things I had no idea what they were or what they might look like. And, because not having access to the internet back then meant I wasn't going to know what these things were unless I could go to the library and find a book that had pictures, which, wasn't necessarily very likely. So having these drawings to show you what the armor and weapons look like, I thought was really cool. And that also like helped me kind of like, it gives you just cool ideas like, oh, my character have this, like those things are cool. Like that stuff looks neat. So I really liked that. So this just goes through and describes the armor and the weapons that you have, okay, for your characters. This is probably the biggest part of this book in terms of its influence on the Dungeons and Dragons game for decades to come, comes from this book. And it starts right here on page 51, Proficiencies. Okay, so it talks about weapon proficiencies, which were a big deal back at the time. Your character started with only a certain number of weapon proficiencies. So unlike things now where like you're like your fighter character knows how to use every martial weapon, in this version of the game, you could use any weapon, but you had to have the proficiency slots to learn, just like a magic user had to have slots to like cast their spells during the day. Every character started out with a certain number of weapon proficiency slots. And if you didn't take proficiency in a certain weapon, you took a penalty when you tried to use that weapon. Okay, so it talks about that, but then it gives you non-weapon proficiencies, okay, and how many you get. And this was a huge deal back in the time. I have talked about this a few times. It came up, I have some videos on skills. I also had a video on ability scores, which is where I really delved into comeliness, if that's something that you're interested in. But this was debuting this concept of non-weapon proficiencies, which we would now call skills. Okay, they just use this very cumbersome, clunky language, calling it non-weapon proficiencies, but they're skills. Now, the way that they're presented in this book, it's basically like you have it or you don't, and if you have it, that means you know how to use it. So there are certain skills that require you to make a roll. And if you fail your roll, that means you didn't do the thing. So if you're an armorer, you have to roll this number or higher on a d20. And if you do, you've made the armor. If you don't, it's a failure and it probably means you've wasted your materials. But for something like brewer, okay, so brewer, if you roll this number or higher, what it means is that you've just made really good beer. It's like exceptional and everybody's going to love it. But if you roll lower, it just means it's average. So it still works. You still make the beer. It just might not be as good as what you wanted, but there's no rules in here for how that affects anything like prices. That's all up to the DM. Okay, so one interesting thing is that these non-weapon proficiencies are not tied to ability scores. So it's a flat number. You're rolling it. Some of them, again, require you to roll for success of success failure. Everything else is just degrees of success, but everything is essentially a success. So it tells you in here, like, if you fail your roll, it doesn't mean that you didn't do it. It just means it's probably not as good as you wanted. Okay, but again, how does that affect things? That's up to you to work out with your DM. But this concept of non-weapon proficiencies is then going to get, now this was only for Oriental Adventures at the time, of course, but again, no reason why you couldn't take these and then adapt them to other types of settings. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, in this particular book, they're divided up into things like you've got artisan, you've got barbarian proficiencies, and then you've got common, and you've got court. Okay. Now, these types of proficiencies that are in here, the lists that you're seeing, you can tell the vast majority of these proficiencies are things that you're going to do in between adventures. It's nothing you're going to use for the most part. that's going to help you in the course of an adventure. And that's what they were intended for, especially when you get to things like court proficiencies, calligraphy, etiquette, flower arranging. All this kind of stuff is not something, tea ceremony. You're not going to, in the middle of an adventure, you're in a dungeon or whatever, you're not going to stop and do a tea ceremony, right? So the idea is that these are things that your character's doing in between adventures as a way to kind of just give them a little bit more personality, a little bit more background, and, show that you could do these things. So the samurai in here a lot, they got a lot of court proficiencies, and it was expected that they would know how to do these things. What's going to happen in the next book that gets published after this book? So this is 1985. The next book that comes out in 1986 is called The Dungeoneers Survival Guide. I just did a video on these maybe a few weeks ago. Dungeoneers and Wilderness Survival Guides. They take the concept of non-weapon proficiencies from here, but expand them, and they start to describe them in terms of things that would be useful in the course of an adventure to help your character. And that's where you get that slippery slope, because then those proficiencies that are helpful during an adventure are going to be the ones that you're going to take, and you're no longer going to take tea ceremony because it's not useful. So that's when you start doing things like, the min-maxing comes out because, if my character has blind sight or blind sense and I can fight when I can't see or I'm blind, that's way better than, calligraphy or, whatever the case may be. Right. So that makes a huge change, creating non-weapon proficiencies that were intended to be used to help you be successful in the course of adventuring. The other thing that those two books do with the non-weapon proficiency system is tie them to ability scores, which was not in here. So that's making ability scores that much more important. As you recall from my video on ability scores, I talked about originally what your score was didn't have a ton of relevance to your character other than helping you get more experience points if it was your prime requisite. Then they started tacking on things like, dexterity helps you with your armor class and your missile attacks, and strength helps you with your damage and that kind of thing. But originally they weren't that important, but every time you do something where you tie something to an ability score, it's making it that much more important to make sure that your ability scores are higher than average. And that was not originally how they were presented. So there's your proficiencies, and then it gets into your spells. Okay, so these are, they're divided up into Shukenja spells and then Wujen spells. Some cool stuff in here. The Wujen spells in particular are pretty neat. I'm not going to get into them now. Now we're in what I would call the DM section. So it's going to get into combat, talk about the sequence of combat, the combat procedures, horseback, bowfire modifiers, that kind of stuff, right? Psychic duels, disarming, subduing opponents, martial arts, and then there's a whole system here for doing martial arts combat, which was kind of cool at the time. I ate it up, and it's this whole thing. Nowadays I look at it as being maybe not very elegant, but at the time I thought it was pretty neat, and I spent a lot of time. This book made me dig out my parents' issues, back issues of National Geographic. They'd started getting it when they were married in the early 60s, and they had every single issue, and a lot of them would cover cultures and things that I just wasn't familiar with. And I found one that talked about this Filipino. No, was it Filipino? It was not. It was a martial arts from India, and Kalari Payatu, something like that. I forget the name of it, but there was a whole issue where it talked about that, and I read it in detail and then tried to recreate it using this system because I thought that was super cool that there was a different martial arts out there that I could create for my games. So I was inspired to try to learn more about these cultures. Then you have your events and encounters. I love this section. It's probably to this day, I would say this is probably my favorite section of this book, which is tracking yearly and monthly events that are happening in the campaign world. So you've got your calendar, and then you've got ambassador, the assassination of a lord, a birth, a comet, the death of a lord, earthquake, famine, just super useful. And again, nothing to do with this being Oriental Adventures. It's just something Dave Cook thought of, and this was the book he was writing, so he stuck it in here. But I use this stuff in my games all the time. I use it in the game I run for my daughter and her friends. I'm running BX D&D, so not AD&D, but I use these kinds of things to inspire me to come up with making sure that the world is, their adventures are taking place in a wider world where things happen. Okay, so I love this section. I still love it. I just think it was very inspirational for me. Then you've got your monsters. It talks about monsters from previous books. And which is cool. There's some cool things in here. And then you have your treasure and magical items, of course. So, and like that's all stuff like the monsters, the treasures and magic items, even like the spells. That's all stuff that you can use in just a, any setting, any D&D game. It doesn't have to be limited to like an Asian style setting. Okay, and some of the stuff is going to end up finding its way into the core game. Again, the big part would really be the proficiency system. All right, and then you have this overview of Kara-Tur. So this is like the setting that Dave Cook ends up creating for this book, which is the name of a vast continental area encompassing within it a tremendous range of climates, terrains, governments, societies, cultures, and beliefs. Okay, and then he says there's basically 4 main empires, which is, too few for a world of, or like a continent of this size. But he says there's 4 main ones, so it's not the only ones. And then those are the only ones he's going to do there. And it's partially a matter of space. It was also just partially a matter of like how much time he had to put this together. So this is going to be expanded. These things they're going to add more and more and more things. And there's going to be, just tons more stuff. But at the time it's described here, and it's very brief. I mean, look at the presentation here of these different, nations. There's like, a paragraph for each, maybe 2 at the most. Talks about daily life, and it gets into things like dress and food. And so this is, again, a section that people do say it's kind of like, it's an extremely overly simplistic view of a very rich, huge, detailed culture, like real world Earth culture. And that's true. It is. I honestly think a lot of it probably just came down to time. They're going to do like whole box sets of this setting later on that gets into like way more detail than what you get here. And then you have this, some maps, the reception hall of a minor daimyo, town, inn, and house, peasant house, and then like what a temple might look like. So, all these kinds of different, maps that you might use. And then we talked about the bibliography. So that's going to be our look at Oriental Adventures. Again, I think the legacy of this, well, it's really 2 things. So from a game mechanics standpoint, the big legacy out of this is, of course, the non-weapon proficiencies that are going to become skills. So non-weapon proficiencies end up becoming, I'd say, a core part of Advanced D&D 2nd Edition, even though in that game I just talked about this, it was presented as being optional. Everybody used it because it was in there, and it was a way to help sort of further define your character. Well, those are then going to be picked up in the 3rd edition forward as skills. And now they're just an integral part of the game. And people, if you've only ever played D&D with skills, I've talked with people before online, like they can't conceive of playing without them. And they don't understand sort of like what the downside is of playing with skills. I have talked about that before. So just make sure to check out those videos that I linked to earlier. So I think the other part of the legacy of this book is that despite some of the way that this material is presented, and it's not always favorable. There's a lot of cliches, a lot of stereotypes, a lot of negative stereotypes that I don't even think that they were intended or thought of as being negative at the time, but they are. But I do think that one of the legacies of this is that it helped expand people's idea of what a Dungeons and Dragons game could be, and that it wasn't just knights and barbarians in a dungeon, that it was expanding the idea of like, what can you do during a game, and what kind of character can you play, and what kind of culture can they be from? And, we saw in these issues of Dragon magazine from before, like all the way back in 1976, when you were talking about that samurai character, like people were interested in this stuff and trying to figure out ways to turn it into game mechanics. So I'm confident that samurai, that was somebody's homebrewed thing. I don't think it was written specifically for the magazine. I suspect someone was playing a samurai in a game and worked with their DM to figure out how to do that, what they thought needed different mechanics. I think you could just as easily just play a fighter character and just say it's a samurai and role play it that way. But, if you want mechanics, like that's what people want out of a game like this. Everybody wants a character class with mechanics and extra goodies to like make themselves different. So I think that this book was sort of one of the things that helped people really think about what are the possibilities of this game? And like, if you have these types of adventures and that are non-Western, what else can we do? What other things can we do? I remember um, around the time that this book came out and realizing what they were doing and that I could do that, I began to dig into, because I was at the time really into ancient Egyptian culture. And I thought, how cool would it be to create a book like this, a setting that was ancient Egypt, and figure out, like, did they have different roles in societies that would map to an existing D&D character class? And then how would I change it? I was a kid. It was an extremely ambitious subject, and it never went anywhere other than, I started making lists of, like, equipment and armor and weapons and things like that. I think that was my first stop. And I was reading the section of the ancient Egyptian deities and demigods, and then I had a few books that like when the 1976, I think the King Tutankhamun exhibit had come through the United States, and one of my grandma's friends had gone to see it in like San Francisco at a museum, and she bought me the catalog and gave it to me. And a decade later, I still had it. I still actually have it to this day. And so I was flipping through that, looking for like images of like, weapons and things like chariots and whatever. Right. So, but I don't know that I would have thought to do that had this book not been coming out, or I was reading about like that they were doing this in Dragon Magazine and thinking like, oh, like of course that makes sense that like my character doesn't have to be, an English knight or a French knight or whatever, or it doesn't have to be like a Germanic barbarian, that kind of thing, or a Scandinavian, Viking or whatever. It can expand beyond that. And I really do think that that is part of the legacy of this book that sometimes gets overlooked, that like it helped people want to learn more as opposed to teaching them about a thing that like maybe it wasn't teaching them the right thing. For me, like I went through the bibliography in the back of this that I showed earlier, and I was going to my school library and seeing if they had any of those books that I could look at, because I knew that like it would help me learn more about these cultures that I just didn't know anything about, because again, I wasn't learning about it in school. So that is going to be it for this video. It's going to wrap it up. And I really hope that you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't get too preachy. I really tried not to. I loved this book as a kid. Like I told you, I was so excited to get it. And I use, those like yearly events tables. I think that's a fun thing to use in my games. And but as a kid, I mean, I was the first one. I got this book. I rolled up a samurai, and I was ready to go. And now we didn't usually play in Kara-Tur. What we did was just put these types of characters into our Western game and said that like they came from somewhere far away that the DM probably hadn't detailed, but we just wanted it for the game mechanics standpoint. We wanted like different, just to do something different. After a while, you think you get tired of doing the same thing. Maybe you do. And so having this whole new book of classes and races and weapons and spells and treasures, it was just stuff that you could just add to like expand your excitement for the game that you had. So I like that a lot. I hope that you like this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Even if you don't like this book and you think it's terrible, again, just be polite in the comments and but tell me what you don't like about it. And, let me know if you think that, there are parts of this that just shouldn't be in there, or whatever. Or maybe it was just too much. Maybe you hate proficiencies. I'm not a fan of them myself. So that's not one of the parts of this book that I like. However, at the time, I thought it was super cool. I loved the proficiency system when it came out. It's just over time, I've kind of soured on proficiencies and skills in a D&D game, like a class and level game. I think doesn't necessarily need them. And again, I've gone all into that before. So if you liked sort of like that historical analysis that I just did on this book and the context that was put out, I would love for you to please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I have a whole playlist on the history of D&D, and I've covered at this point, pretty much every AD&D hardback, at least in one video or another. So you can get a whole history. They're all presented differently. They're not like this. Again, I don't script my videos, so a lot of it just comes off the top of my head. So I would appreciate if you could do that. When you're leaving a comment down below, make sure to check out places in the show notes where you can join me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And then you can also find links to my blog where I do post content from time to time. Most of it's compatible with 1981 BX D&D, but it's also a lot of it is edition or system neutral. And I think that's going to be it for now. So, I do want to once again thank my super fans. who have been contributing. I just appreciate it so very much. And you guys have been great. And until I get a Patreon up and going, super fans or visiting my shop are the two best ways for you to help support the channel. And but I will, I am working on a Patreon, and I hope that those of you that are interested in that kind of thing will let me know in the comments and what kind of content you'd want to see from a Patreon like that. So thank you again so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. All right, now for the bonus content. What I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So as you can tell, there were a lot of notes. I don't script my videos, but I definitely did a lot of bullet points for this one on sort of that upfront part. I'd thought of most of what I wanted to say before, as far as like, how the United States began to kind of be interested in learning more about Asian culture, and the economic part and the political part and the pop culture part. Those are all kinds of things that I just kind of had rolling around in my head, but I kind of needed to write it down to make sure I didn't forget anything. There were obviously a lot of pop culture influences, and I did do some research to make sure that I hit the main ones. I'm sure there's some I forgot. So let me know in the comments what you thought about that and anything else that you think I should be looking at. But I decided to drink a little of this. You guys have probably noticed by now I mostly drink whiskey. I love gin. Don't drink gin neat, but whiskey I will drink neat. So this is, interestingly, a Swiss Highlander malt whiskey. So a friend brought this back to me. She went on vacation, and she knows I like whiskey and, just trying different spirits that I otherwise wouldn't normally get here. And so she brought this back. So it's always really nice when your friends just kind of get you. So I was very happy that she brought this back, and I've kind of been saving it, because it's one of these things where it's like, once this is gone, I don't know that I'm ever going to get it again. But, I wouldn't say Switzerland's necessarily known for making malt whiskey. So this is, I'm guessing, I don't know what to do with these two dots over this A here. I guess I should have looked that up. But SÄNTIS malt, Swiss Highlander, Appenzeller single malt, matured in small oak beer casks, which might sound a little odd. This is edition SIGEL. They it says, for many years the beer has been stored in the small oak casks, which are now passing their distinctive flavor onto our SÄNTIS malt edition SIGEL, each drop an extract of this pass. So this is made by brewery Locker. And so they are the beer brewer. That's where they started from. And they began distilling, I think, in 1999, which is the year it first became legal to kind of do that. So it's Switzerland. And they are, like, I believe, one of, if not the biggest distillers in Switzerland. And so, this is obviously kind of a unique thing because you don't normally age whiskey in beer barrels. If anything, you do it the other way around, right? People probably had like bourbon barrel-aged stouts and things like that. So it says, in the Alpstein range, pristine springs are hidden to this day, guarded by the people like a precious treasure. And it says, finest jewel. And then, a fresh breeze is blowing through the Appenzell Mountains, making room for time and leisure. The right mix for our SÄNTIS malt. Peaceful place. I mean, it does look awesome. I mean, this looks like something right out of, like what's that, Sound of Music or something? For many years, beer has been stored in the small oak beer casks, which now pass on their special flavor to our SÄNTIS malt, each drop an extract of this pass. So we already kind of saw that on the back. And then it says, my single malt matured in my beloved small oak beer casks, close by the Alpstein range. And then it's signed by the brewmaster. So, it's interesting. I'll just put it that way. I wouldn't say it's necessarily even anywhere in my top list of favorite whiskeys, but cheers, and thanks again for watching through to the bonus content, something I always appreciate. So, one of the things I noticed right away is there's kind of like this weird, like artificial candy smell on this. There's a little citrus, maybe some strawberry, but like there's a weird kind of fruitiness that it's hard to kind of put your how to describe it. Mm. So very light in color, as you can see. It's also very light in flavor. It's extremely light, even though it's bottled at 40%. I mean, you do get a little bit of the alcoholic burn, but like flavor wise, there's just not a lot of depth here. Interestingly enough, I mean, you can definitely tell that this was aged in some kind of beer cask. Those flavors come through on the finish. Um, it's a little viscous in the mouth. It's different. It's fun to have. I thought I would share this with you guys because I'm assuming most of you have never had this before. I don't think it's super common. At least I've never seen it anywhere here in the U.S. So, again, my kind of thing is like if I'm somewhere and they have something that I've never had before, I'm probably going to get it because I don't know when I could ever get it again. So if I were at a bar, even if they had my favorite whiskey on there that I've had a gazillion times, which I don't really have a favorite. It depends on my mood. So my mood might be Scotch at the time, it might be rye, it might be whatever, and it just sort of depends, right? But if I'd seen this and it said Swiss malt, whiskey, I probably would have ordered it just because I'm like, all right, let's give it a shot. So now this is light enough that I don't feel the need to add water. I feel like it's already been watered down, even though it is at 40%. It's just, again, it's not super complex. All right. Well, interesting. My album, Thelonious Monk plays Duke Ellington. So this is such a fun album. I really dig it. So the story of this, 1955. So Monk is with Riverside Records. This is their first like, I want to say 12-inch. Yeah, is the first 12-inch contemporary jazz LP issued by Riverside. So Riverside was a pretty big label for jazz back in the day. I mean, nothing along the lines of like a Blue Note or even Verve, but at their time, I mean, they had like Chet Baker for a long time. So I mentioned like last video, the most expensive vinyl that I have in my collection is a box set of Chet Baker albums, all by Riverside. And so the story of this was that Thelonious Monk, if you know him, he's a bop style pianist. He's very wild. They call him like the mad genius. And his style was sometimes very off-putting to people because they just didn't get it. They didn't know how to listen to it. So that's one thing about jazz. It can be a challenge, which is partly why I enjoy it so much, because it's just not the same, 3 chords in notes that you hear all the time and like, in a pop song, right? It's challenging you to like actually spend some time and think about it. And but Monk could be out there, especially again at the time. This is like the mid 50s, so you haven't even gotten into like the fusion and all the like really weird stuff. There's no like Ornette Coleman Shape of Jazz to Come is still like 4 years away, right? So that kind of like free jazz is not even there yet. But Monk is like really in that time period is like the guy that like people think is like, this is why people hate jazz, like why jazz is weird, right? So Riverside wants him to be a little bit more accessible. And so they work with him to have him record the standards by Duke Ellington, who was one of, if not the preeminent jazz songwriter, like of his age. So Duke Ellington is so important in the history of jazz. A lot of people don't know this. He was the first Black person invited to the White House to like go inside, not as like a servant, but like, because of who he was, he's so important in jazz. And so his songs are ubiquitous within jazz. I mean, just look at these, It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, Sophisticated Lady, Mood Indigo, Solitude, Caravan. These are all classic songs that, if you know your jazz catalog, these songs. And even if you don't, you've probably heard most of these songs before, even if it's just from quotes in like, say, pop or rock songs where they'll like reference these things. They're that timeless. And so this is like the first album Monk does where it's not originals. Or at least some originals. This is all for quote unquote covers. These are songs written by Duke Ellington that he's going to do for this album. And it's really fun. It's fun to listen to him put his style on these songs that people were familiar with. So you don't have to wrestle with this idea that like not only is his playing style very different, but you're listening to unfamiliar music. Well, in this case, that's not true. You're listening to a familiar song, so you kind of know how it's going to go, but you're hearing Monk put his stamp on it, and it's really, really fun. So I like Monk anyway, so I'm not one who's put off by his music style, but I'm also come to this much later where I've heard so many other different things that there's no reason to, but at the time there were people that just didn't get it, but this was a way to kind of help get him exposure with people that normally weren't listening to him. So definitely highly recommend giving this a chance. Check it out. He's also just a great piano player. I mean, that's just and he's a fun performer to watch. He has a very interesting style. His fingers, like, normally you play the piano. My piano teacher always used to call it the house. She's like, make a house. Make sure your fingers are curved and, do this. His fingers are out there, man. It's like, and he's just banging like really hard. And it's just like, it's very interesting to watch. And, but just also when that's how he plays, when you hear this, you'll hear it. You'll definitely hear it. So I hope you like that. Like I said, give it a shot. It's, it's going to be on all your streaming services. It's a pretty popular album. And thanks again for staying through this. I really hope that you liked the stuff on Oriental Adventures. It's, it's in there as far as like one of my favorite advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardbacks. It's probably in my top 3. As far as like in the day, remembering like how important it was to me to get that book. So thanks for watching. Cheers. Please check out some of these other videos, and I will talk to you next time.